He paid his bills every Monday, regular as the sunrise. I think it was a robbery gone wrong. But they didn't take anything, Constance pointed out. Then perhaps it was personal. That phrase lingered in the air like steam from the tea urn at the vicarage. Personal, a word that could mean nearly anything in a village so small, where everyone's history bled quietly into everyone else's dot at the general store. Mrs. Amelia Winthrop fumbled with her change and knocked over a display of barley sugar. Clumsy of me, she said faintly, then added, "It's just that I've hardly slept since. You know, dreadful business. Double quotes Mrs. Thatcher, who ran the till, leaned in conspiratorially. They say he had bruises on his head." Amelia froze. Who says? Oh, you know how it is. Someone tells someone else, and it all makes its way here eventually. That's dangerous talk, Amelia said, her voice tightening. Poor William may have simply fallen. Mrs. Thatcher raised her eyebrows. Well, that's one way of looking at it. Outside, Miss Marple stood near the window display of pickled onions and dishcloths, her shopping basket dangling from her wrist. Pretending to browse, she had heard every word. In the parlour of the vicarage, Reverend Edgecombe confided in Miss Marple over a plate of custard creams. William Hartley was a solitary man. Yes, he said, but not unkind. He looked after the railway garden. Did you know that? Planted those wild primroses himself, and he used to bring roses to the church once a fortnight. Never made a fuss. Miss Marple nodded, folding her hands in her lap. And did he have any acquaintances? She asked delicately. Close friendships? The Reverend blinked. Well, not that I ever saw, although I do recall Mrs. Winthrop being rather fond of him once. Back when she'd first moved to the village, they were often seen walking the green together. Were they? Miss Marple said gently. That's interesting. I wouldn't read too much into it, he said. People are quick to pair off anyone seen sharing more than one conversation. It's village law. But the heart, Miss Marple replied softly, doesn't always follow village law. At the apothecary, young Alice Blanchard, the schoolmistress, was refilling her lavender sachets when she found herself accosted by Mrs. Biddle again. You were always friendly with William, weren't you? The older woman asked, eyes gleaming with the hunger for drama. I was polite, said Alice, her tone guarded. Come now, you used to have him over for tea. That was 3 years ago. He helped me repair the gate latch, and nothing more. Alice flushed. No, nothing more. He was kind, and I respected that. Well, someone didn't. The remark hung between them like a wasp, and Alice's fingers trembled as she turned away. That afternoon, Eliza Huntley set down her garden shears with a huff. Jane, the village is eating itself alive. Half of them have already decided who did it. Yes, Miss Marple said. And none of them are right. Eliza squinted at her. What makes you so sure? Because none of the theories account for the bruise behind the ear, or the scratch marks on the hand, or the fact that William Hartley always used the left side of the crossing gate. And that's not where he was found. Eliza stared. What are you saying? I'm saying, Miss Marple replied, That this wasn't the result of chance, or heart failure, or even an argument gone wrong. She looked out over the path leading to Finchmere Crossing, now quiet, half covered in fallen petals and sun-dabbled shadow. This was planned, timed, done in a place that everyone forgets until they're walking through it. And the motive, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. That, dear Eliza, is the bit that will always give them away. Because in villages like ours, no one ever kills for nothing. It's always something personal, but rarely the kind of personal that people expect. As dusk fell, and the day's theories cooled into the embers of bedtime stories, Miss Marple sat by the window once again, knitting in rhythmic silence. She thought of William Hartley's careful routines, his kindness, his quiet sadness, and the peculiar way Amelia Winthrop had gone pale when his name was mentioned. Yes, the village was buzzing, but all the buzz had missed one crucial thing. Everyone had remembered what William did. No one had asked what William knew, and that, Miss Marple was certain, would prove to be the key. Detective Inspector Raymond Walsh arrived in St. Leonards-in-the-Fen on Thursday morning, his shoes polished for country mud, and his tone just clipped enough to rattle the vicar's nerves. He was a lean man with thinning hair and a face like unbuttered toast. Practical, plain, and faintly displeased to be anywhere south of Reading. Sergeant Willis met him at the station platform and led him through the village, where twitching curtains followed them like a Greek chorus. Small place, Walsh muttered, already unimpressed. Willis nodded, quiet as anything, until Tuesday. They made their way to the constable's office, a converted back room in the old toll house, where the inspector set down his briefcase and promptly began reviewing the preliminary report. He grunted when he read the medical note. Double quotes Dr. Graham. Says it could have been natural causes, he said. But this bruise behind the ear bothers me. Willis nodded again. Also found skin under the fingernails. Scraped, like he tried to grab something while falling. HM. Anything stolen? No, sir. Watch. Wallet, everything intact. Witnesses? Willis hesitated. Well, not exactly witnesses, but the whole village has something to say. Walsh looked up. Of course they do. Put 20 people in a street, and you get 100 opinions. Put them in a village, you get 1,000. Later that afternoon, Walsh walked the site himself. Finchmere Crossing, where a light wind stirred. The tall grass and birds trilled innocently in the hedgerows. The path had been cleared now, though faint prints still marked the softer earth. Hartley's shoe, recovered and bagged, had been discovered 6 feet away from the body, not where one would expect it to land during a simple fall. He was facing this way when he hit the ground, Walsh observed, squatting near the spot. But the crossing gate's over there. Odd. Yes, sir, said Willis. Miss Marple mentioned that he always used the left side, said it was habit. Walsh frowned. Miss who? Miss Marple, guest of Mrs. Eliza Huntley. Knows her way around people. She noticed the bruise before the doctor did. Walsh sighed. Brilliant. An amateur sleuth. I do love being told how to do my job by someone who knits. Willis said nothing. He had learned it was best. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple prepared a fresh tray of lemon scones. She had heard of Walsh's arrival not from any official notice, but from the stammering of young Millie Harper, who'd seen him arrive and breathlessly described him as a man with eyes like an offended goose. "Well," said Eliza, sipping her tea, "at least it's official now. Maybe he'll get some answers." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Answers are only useful when one knows the right questions to ask. Inspector Walsh held his first round of interviews in the parish hall, neutral ground, quiet acoustics, and enough tea to bribe any witness. The villagers filed in one by one, some nervous, others far too eager. Amelia Winthrop arrived in a navy coat buttoned all the way to the throat. Mr. Hartley was a kind man, she said carefully. Reserved, yes, but never unpleasant. Were you close? Walsh asked. She blinked. Not especially, but you took walks together. She flushed. Only when I first moved here. We both enjoyed the church garden. It was years ago. Walsh made a note. Did you see him the day he died? No, not since the weekend. We waved across the road on Sunday morning. Did he seem upset? Nervous? I know. Not that I recall. Her voice caught slightly on the last word. Walsh looked up. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Mrs. Winthrop, she shook her head. Only that I hope you find out what happened. People are frightened. He dismissed her, then sat in silence for a moment before calling the next name. Alice Blanchard arrived shortly afterward, her eyes shadowed from poor sleep. I suppose I'm one of the last people to speak to him, she admitted. He stopped. By my gate Monday evening, said he was looking forward to Tuesday's meeting. Walsh raised an eyebrow. Did he say why? She hesitated. No, just that he had something to bring. A seedling? Alice frowned. No, something else. He said, it's time it saw the light. That was his exact phrase. Walsh scribbled furiously. St. Leonard's in the Fen was the kind of village that only seemed to exist in the pages of books. Tucked away between sleepy pastures and moss-covered stone walls, with ivy creeping like gossip over every fence. Finchmere crossing, a narrow footpath intersecting the old railway line just beyond the vicar's orchard, was as uneventful as it sounded. It had once been a proper stop, back in the days of steam and station masters with brass buttons, but now served only as a shortcut for school children and Sunday walkers making their way to the church. It was the second Tuesday of the month, a Tuesday indistinguishable from any other in that corner of Hampshire, and the Women's Fellowship Club had gathered, as always, at the parish hall. The scent of fresh Victoria sponge and lemon polish filled the air as elderly ladies arranged folding chairs and swapped rhubarb cuttings. Outside, the late spring sun played over a row of polished bicycles, and an old Labrador snored beside the cricket shed. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, knitting needles flashing quietly in her lap. She had been invited, of course, though she was not strictly a local. Her nephew Raymond had arranged for her to spend a few weeks away from St. Mary Mead. For her nerves, though no one could quite agree what her nerves might need recovering from. Still, she had come to visit her old friend Mrs. Eliza Huntley, a brisk woman with bramble-scraped hands and a tongue sharp enough to dice turnips. "Oh, Jane," said Eliza now, passing her a cup of weak tea. "Don't look at me like that. It's not poison, you know." Miss Marple smiled benignly. "Oh, I'm sure it isn't, though I do confess, I never quite trust a woman who puts milk in before the tea." From the far end of the room came a chuckle. "You've made an enemy of half the county with that remark," said Reverend Basil Edgecombe, who had arrived in his usual cloud of tweed and pipe smoke. "The Milk First Brigade will have you hanged." Miss Marple merely raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I dare say they might try." The hall was beginning to fill now. A clatter of chairs, a rustle of gossip. Young Alice Blanchard, the schoolmistress, had brought her usual tray of homemade jam tarts, and Dr. Graham stood awkwardly by the window, holding a cup of tea as though it might explode. Everyone was here, or nearly everyone, except, as it happened, for Mr. William Hartley. This small fact that one man failed to appear at a gathering he never missed would not seem remarkable to most, but Miss Marple, as was her habit, noticed such things. Noticed the absence, noticed the silence, and noticed, too, that when Mrs. Amelia Winthrop dropped the teaspoon she was carrying and let it clatter to the floor, no one else seemed to think it odd. Only Miss Marple saw the faint tremble in her hand, and the way her face had gone pale under its usual pink blush. "A chill," said Amelia, catching Miss Marple's eye. "It's the draught, I think, from the vestry." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "The wind does have a way of slipping in when it's least welcome." By late afternoon, the meeting had wound down. Saucers scraped against one another. Chairs were folded, and murmured farewells drifted into the golden air. Miss Marple, walking arm in arm with Eliza down the garden path behind the parish hall, paused when she reached the corner where the low stone wall dipped, and one could just glimpse the railway footpath. Finchmere crossing lay ahead, its wooden slats half swallowed by grass and years. Crows circled lazily overhead. A single crow cawed, low and ragged. "He should have been here," said Eliza, not looking at her. "Who?" "Dear, William Hartley. He never misses a club day. And he promised to bring a seedling for my winter roses." Miss Marple looked out toward the distant path. "Perhaps he forgot." "No," Eliza said with a certainty that was, somehow, unsettling. "William doesn't forget things, especially not when he's made a promise." There was a long pause. Then, as if drawn by an unspoken instinct, both women turned their eyes toward Finchmere Crossing, that quiet, overgrown strip of land where the village's old railway line met the footpath dot, and where, though no one yet knew it, something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. The news broke the next morning, as many things did in St. Leonard's, through the mouth of Mrs. Maud Peverell, the postmistress and unofficial nerve center of village communication. By the time Miss Marple stirred her second cup of morning tea, it was already circulating among hedgerows and parlor walls like a startled bird. "Found him just past the orchard," Maud whispered hoarsely to Mrs. Eliza Huntley, as though the apple trees themselves might overhear. "Face down near the crossing gate. The boy who delivers milk spotted him. Thought he was drunk at first. Poor lamb. He's only 12. Found who? Asked Eliza, who, having lived through 2 wars, 6 floods, and 17 attempts at local council reform, did not frighten easily. William Hartley, said Maud, making the sign of the cross in a muddled sort of way. Dead. By midday, the village green buzzed like a disturbed beehive. The constable had been seen trudging toward the scene, trailed by Sergeant Willis, whose boots always gave him away 3 streets before rival. A barrier of canvas had gone up across the railway path, though there was nothing to see from the road except for a single brown shoe lying just past the brambles. That's his, said Reverend Edgecombe, pointing needlessly. How ghastly, muttered someone else. He was a good man, quiet, always quiet, had a limp, remember, walked that same route every Tuesday. Miss Marple arrived just after 1 o'clock. She made no fuss, didn't join the crowd. Instead, she positioned herself a little apart, near the low wall where the early roses were just starting to bloom. Her eyes, a soft blue behind the wire spectacles, missed nothing. The scene was deceptively calm. A blackbird flitted between branches. The path ahead drowsed in sunlight, but Miss Marple's mind was already walking the route William Hartley had taken from his cottage on Pevensey Lane, past the vicar's orchard, and down toward Finchmere Crossing. He had not made it home. Later that afternoon, Sergeant Willis delivered what passed for a formal update. No signs of struggle. He told a gathering of villagers outside the post office, likely heart failure or a stroke. Dr. Graham's examining him now. Heart trouble, was it? Asked Mrs. Amelia Winthrop, voice just a shade too curious. Possibly, said the sergeant. Though strange, he ended up face down in the mud, wouldn't you say? Hands scratched too. Looks like he tried to catch himself on the fence. A murmur went through the group. Was anything stolen? Asked Reverend Edgecombe. Doesn't appear so. He still had his wallet, coins, and watch. Then what was he doing out there? Someone whispered. If he wasn't robbed or attacked, on his way home, I expect, said the sergeant vaguely, tugging at his collar. Miss Marple didn't speak, but she did turn slightly at that moment, just enough to observe Amelia Winthrop again, the same Amelia whose hands had trembled the day before, and whose color now seemed drained as if by some internal frost. That evening, Mrs. Eliza Huntley lit the lamps early and turned off the wireless. You don't believe it was natural causes, she said, handing Miss Marple a plate of ham and pickle sandwiches. I haven't said anything, said Miss Marple gently. No, but I've seen your look, Jane. The one where you go all still, like a cat in long grass. Miss Marple paused, then took a bite. She chewed thoughtfully. I expect we'll hear heart failure confirmed by tomorrow, she said. But the trouble is, Eliza, hearts don't often fail on schedule. Nor do they fail in the middle of a muddy path with fingernails full of bark and a bruise behind the left ear. Eliza dropped her sandwich. What bruise? Miss Marple leaned back, folded her napkin, and gave her friend a look full of quiet gravity. Dr. Graham wouldn't have mentioned it to most people, she said, but he's known me a long time. and he's seen enough soldiers to know a bruise caused by a fall and one caused by something else. There was a silence in the room, thick as rising dough. Then you think someone killed him? Eliza whispered. Miss Marple sipped her tea. I think someone very much wanted William Hartley not to speak, and I think the village, whether it knows it or not, has already given us some hints. By nightfall, the village was tucked into its usual routines, curtains drawn, fires banked. The world had turned, as it always did, despite tragedy. But behind those sleepy windows, conversations simmered. Why had Hartley been out so late? Who had seen him last? Was it true he'd once been engaged to a woman who died mysteriously years ago? And all the while, Miss Marple whereupon quietly by the window in Eliza's guest room, the click-click of her needles almost rhythmic. Her mind wandered, not aimlessly, but deliberately, combing through half-spoken remarks, subtle reactions, and the peculiar silence of those who usually had too much to say. In St. Leonard's, in the fen, someone was hiding something, and Miss Marple, as always, intended to find out what. By Wednesday morning, the village of St. Leonard's in the fen was a pressure cooker of politely concealed speculation. The Hartley case, as it was now unofficially dubbed, had migrated from shocked whispers to confident conjectures, from the butcher's counter to the vestry steps, in garden allotments, and under the hairdryer at Mrs. Prothero's salon. Everyone had a theory. He was probably in debt, insisted Mrs. Constance Biddle, who had once caught William Hartley arguing with the grocer over a miscounted penny. Men like that always act high and mighty when they're hiding something. Nonsense, retorted Mr. Timothy Longhurst, who had lived next door to Hartley for 2 decades. And what did you think he meant? She shook her head. I didn't know. I still don't. By the end of the day, Walsh had filled half a notebook and come no closer to the truth. No one had seen anything. No one had heard a cry. No one knew why a man with no enemies would end up dead by a disused crossing, with a bruise behind the ear and a shoe tossed meters from where it should have been. That night, he returned to the vicarage as a guest, offered the spare room and a tot of brandy by the well-meaning reverend. Miss Marple was already seated in the drawing room, knitting a delicate pattern that seemed almost symbolic. Walsh-eyed her. You've got something on your mind, haven't you? Oh no, said Miss Marple gently. Just patterns. I do find them helpful. You see, Walsh snorted. I prefer fingerprints. Yes, said Miss Marple, but people are ever so much messier than fingerprints. He looked at her a moment longer, then left without another word. As the door shut behind him. Miss Marple looked down at her knitting, a curious diamond motif, to dropped stitches to the side, and smiled faintly to herself. The inspector had only just arrived. The village was still talking, but the heart of the matter, she suspected, had already revealed itself. It was simply waiting for someone to listen. William Hartley had always been a quiet man, polite, punctual, neat to the point of suspicion. In St. Leonard's, in the fen, those traits marked a man as either deeply respectable or deeply secretive. No one could quite decide which he had been. Inspector Walsh began with the basics. Hartley had lived alone for nearly 20 years in a modest cottage on Pevensey Lane, where ivy climbed the window panes and the front gate creaked with the rhythm of the seasons. No pets, no visitors. His routines were so precise that the milkman used them to adjust his own rounds. He walked every morning at 8. He returned home from the allotments by 10. He never missed the Tuesday fellowship meetings, and he spent Sunday mornings tending the roses at the churchyard. No family? Walsh asked Sergeant Willis. None local. One sister up in Yorkshire, estranged for years, they say. Why? Willis scratched his head. No one seems to know. Some say a disagreement about their parents' will. Others think it had something to do with a girl he was once engaged to. A girl. Willis nodded. Maureen Littleton. She died young. Car accident. Back in 39. After that, he stopped courting entirely. Walsh frowned. Tragic, yes, but not exactly suspicious. No, sir. But that's when he changed. Started keeping to himself. Miss Marple, of course, had been listening to a different thread entirely. She visited the churchyard that morning under the guise of placing new dahlias on a grave. But what she was really doing was remembering. She remembered the way Hartley had always lingered a little too long by the older graves. The ones with faded names and weather-worn epitaphs. The kind of graves no one visited anymore. She also remembered a conversation, years earlier, at a different tea in a different village, in which a man had said, "Secrets don't die with the dead. They wait like bones in the earth. They wait to be uncovered." Now, as she looked across the rows of stone and lichen, she thought of Hartley's peculiar last words, relayed by young Alice Blanchard. It's time it saw the light. What it was, no one knew. But Miss Marple had an idea, a small, fluttering instinct, that it had nothing to do with plants or gardening at all. Meanwhile, Walsh took it upon himself to inspect Hartley's cottage. The interior was spotless, like a museum exhibit of solitary English life. A kettle that whistled on the dot. Rows of books ranged by height. A brass clock ticking so softly it almost sounded apologetic. But in the back room, the one with the old writing desk, Walsh found the first sliver of curiosity. There, among neatly stacked papers and uncashed pension checks, was a folded envelope with no stamp and no address, just a name, A.W. inside. Was a letter written in Hartley's tight, deliberate hand. I cannot carry this alone any longer. What we did, what we chose not to do, still weighs on me. If you're reading this, I hope you can finally admit what I've always known. Silence is no longer safety. People will be hurt if this comes out. But perhaps they already were. Perhaps we delayed the pain without ever avoiding it. I'm tired. I don't want to keep it hidden anymore. No signature, no details, but the tone. Confessional, burdened, haunted, chilled Walsh. He tucked it back into the envelope and made a note. Later that day, he asked Alice Blanchard if she recognized the initials. A.W.? She repeated, thinking. Could be Amelia Winthrop. You're sure? Well, her middle name is Alice. Amelia Alice Winthrop. People used to tease her about it at school. She never uses it now. Walsh nodded slowly. Did she and Mr. hardly know each other well. Alice hesitated. I think they were close once, but something soured it. That night, Eliza Huntley sat by the fire with Miss Marple, eyes narrowed, arms folded. I don't like it, she said. This idea that William Hartley was hiding some terrible sin. He wasn't that sort. People rarely are, Miss Marple replied, setting her knitting aside. Until they are, Eliza sighed. You think it has to do with that letter? I think it has to do with something long buried. Perhaps even literally. Something William finally decided he couldn't keep quiet about. You think he was silenced before he could tell? Miss Marple gave her a long, quiet look. I think he was going to speak, and someone was very afraid of what he might say. In the quiet of her guest bedroom, Miss Marple unfolded her notes. She had written nothing down, of course, merely observed and recalled, as she always did. But in her mind, a pattern was beginning to emerge. William Hartley, solitary, burdened, ready to confess. Amelia Winthrop, nervous, evasive, connected. To his past, Alice Blanchard, a chance confidant, but too young to be part of the original secret. The letter, full of guilt, not anger, and addressed to someone who shared responsibility. The crossing, a place of quiet, forgotten use, and perfect for a private confrontation. One question floated to the top of her mind. What secret would tie two respectable people together in guilt for 20 years? And what could make one of them kill to keep it buried? Outside, the wind sighed through the hedges. Inside, Miss Marple reached for her tea. Somewhere between the silence and the stories, the truth had already begun to form. By Friday morning, the village had quietly, and without needing any official encouragement, named its first suspect, Amelia Winthrop. It wasn't the police, of course. Inspector Walsh had not yet said anything directly, but the look he gave her after the second interview had stuck with those who noticed. And in a place like St. Leonard's, in the fen, where silence was rarely golden and always suspicious, even the suggestion of scrutiny was enough to stain a person's name. She was quite flushed. You know, Mrs. Constance Biddle murmured at the greengrocer's, her voice low but insistent, when he asked about that letter. What letter? Asked Mr. Longhurst. Oh, I don't know, she replied quickly. But there was one, and they say it was addressed to her, Mrs. Peveril. Never far from the scent of scandal, leaned in. And wasn't she the last one to leave the meeting on Tuesday, just after William didn't show? Oh my, said someone else. You don't think she met him at the crossing, do you? I don't like to speculate, said Mrs. Biddle, doing exactly that. Amelia herself seemed to sense the tide turning. She appeared at the post office mid-morning with her collar to stiff and her smile to tight. I suppose everyone's talking, she said aloud. To no one in particular. Mrs. Thatcher blinked from behind the counter. About what, dear? Amelia exhaled sharply. About William. About me. About whatever that man from the city is sniffing around for. No one's accusing you of anything, Thatcher said smoothly and unconvincingly. Well, they shouldn't, Amelia snapped, her voice cracking just enough to draw attention from the queue behind her. William and I, we hadn't spoken in weeks. We drifted. She collected her stamps in silence and walked stiffly into the sunshine, followed by the soft sound of whispered speculation. Back at the vicarage, Inspector Walsh reviewed his notes. She's nervous, he told Sergeant Willis. Won't meet my eyes. Evades questions. And this letter, it was never sent. He left it in a drawer. Why? Maybe he planned to confront her, Willis suggested. Or maybe she already knew. Walsh leaned back in the creaking vicarage chair. What we've got is circumstantial. No proof. And I don't like leaning on a woman's nerves unless I'm sure they're guilty. Willis shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple doesn't seem convinced either. I wondered if you might spare me 5 minutes. I'm thinking of reading aloud something for the recital. I'm torn between Wordsworth and Christina Rossetti. Alice's face lit with professional kindness. Both excellent choices, though. Rossetti has more tension, I suppose. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, full of grief and unspoken things. Quite appropriate for the times, wouldn't you say? Alice looked down at the chairs. Yes, things feel heavy lately. Miss Marple gently adjusted a stack of papers beside her. I've often thought the hardest part of being young is knowing who to trust with sorrow. I imagine Mr. Hartley felt safe with you. Alice stiffened slightly. I don't know why he told me anything. We weren't close. Perhaps he needed to tell someone who didn't know the full story. Someone who wouldn't be burdened by the weight of the past. Alice's hands froze on a chair back. Or someone he hoped would do what he couldn't. That, at last, was something. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the cottage and took out a small pressed flower from a folded handkerchief. Not the original, of course, that had long since withered by the footpath. But she had found others just like it growing beneath the southern window of the church. Forget-me-nots, planted 3 years ago by Alice Blanchard Dott at the vicarage. Inspector Walsh was poring over the usual puzzle of timelines and testimonies. None of it added up. He had mapped out William Hartley's final hours a dozen times, only for the details to slip between his fingers like sand. Miss Marple entered quietly. I don't mean to intrude, she said, but may I trouble you with a small observation? Walsh leaned back, weary. At this point, Miss Marple, I welcome any trouble you can offer. She sat down gently across from him and held up the pressed flower. This, she said softly, was found near William's body. It does not grow there, but it does grow outside the church, where young Alice tends the beds. Walsh frowned. Are you saying she was there? I'm saying that William may have carried it with him, or more precisely, someone may have tucked it into his coat. Walsh blinked. As a token, as a message, said Miss Marple, or a warning. He called Alice in the next morning. She entered quietly, pale, but calm. I hear you tend the flowers by the church. Walsh began. Yes. Did William Hartley ever comment on them? Alice looked confused. Yes, actually. He said the forget-me-nots reminded him of someone. Someone lost? I assumed Maureen. And did you give him one? She swallowed. A few. Weeks ago, after a conversation we had. He seemed troubled. I thought it would comfort him. And did you see him on the day he died? Alice was silent. Then, yes, briefly. I passed him near the orchard. Did he have anything with him? No, just his walking stick. You're certain? Yes. Her voice wavered. Just once. After she left, Walsh turned to Miss Marple. She's hiding something. Yes, Miss Marple said. But not out of guilt. Walsh looked up. What then? Out of protection. That evening, Miss Marple met with Margaret once more, this time under no pretense at all. They sat in the vicarage garden, where dusk spilled over the flower beds, and the hedgerows murmured with crickets. Tell me, Margaret, Miss Marple said gently, why did you really come to St. Leonard's? Margaret blinked. To stay with Amelia. After my father died, she offered. And have you been happy here? A pause. Then, I've been safe. Even now. Margaret looked away. I'm not sure. Miss Marple let the silence stretch. A net, not a gap dot at last. Margaret whispered. I know something. I shouldn't. But I do. What is it? Dear, I followed Amelia once, a few months ago. She went to the crossing. She was talking to someone I couldn't see. But she looked furious, like she was afraid of losing control. And then, she never spoke of it. But afterward, she was calmer, as if she'd decided something. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Did she ever speak of Alice? No. But she watches her, like someone watching a lit match in a dark room. That night, Miss Marple returned to her room and sat in the window's pale glow. The flower had been the clue, not because of what it was, but because it didn't belong where it was found. It was a message, a fragment, a farewell, not from a killer, but from a man who knew he would not survive the truth he was about to speak, and someone, perhaps not the one everyone suspected, had ensured he never got the chance. St. Leonard's in the Fen had always considered itself an honest village. Its people swept their porches, remembered birthdays, and helped each other carry baskets after market day. But honesty, like sunlight, rarely reached beneath the hedges, and by the time a week had passed since William Hartley's death, the shade beneath the hedgerows had grown thick with secrets. Everywhere Miss Marple turned, she saw them. Not new secrets, mind you, but old ones. Secrets polished from decades of being tucked away. Secrets that had been fed in silence until they grew into things far more dangerous than lies. The first to break was Reverend Edgecombe. He found Miss Marple in the churchyard one morning, tending to a drooping clump of marigolds with surprising gentleness for someone her age. He hesitated, hat in hand, then cleared his throat. I ought to speak to someone, Miss Marple. She looked up. You've come to the right patch of soil. He sat on the stone bench near the gate. It was 20 years ago. He began, no closer to 23. William came to me, just after Maureen died. He was not himself, haggard. He told me he'd found a letter, a note in Maureen's coat pocket. It had been half washed away by the rain, but he read what he could. Miss Marple's knitting hands paused. A suicide note. Edgecombe shook his head. No, a warning. He exhaled slowly. It said, if I don't come back, it was never an accident. Miss Marple blinked once. then turned back to her flowers. "Why didn't you tell the police?" "William made me swear not to. He said it would destroy people, that he needed time to think." "And you believed him?" "I believed he believed it," the Reverend said quietly, "and I believed in the power of remorse." Meanwhile, the schoolhouse cracked as well. Miss Marple had tea with Alice Blanchard again. A quiet affair under the guise of discussing a new story for the children's reading corner. "I've been thinking about William," Alice said, stirring her tea. Slowly, he said something to me, something that made no sense at the time. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. He said, "You never see the roots until the tree falls." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And what do you think he meant?" Alice stared into her cup. "That something was buried long ago, and that he'd finally found out what." There was a pause, then Alice added, "He asked me to hold onto something." Miss Marple didn't move. Alice reached into her bag and removed a small paper-wrapped bundle. Inside was an old photograph. Two young women, smiling, arms linked, standing in front of a wild, overgrown hedge. In the background, just visible, the edge of the Finchmere crossing gate. On the back was written, "What we chose not to see." That afternoon, Inspector Walsh paced the small path outside the vicarage, notebook in hand. Frown deepening. "I've got pieces, Miss Marple," he grumbled, "but none of them connect." "Oh, but they do," Miss Marple said gently, pouring him tea. "They simply don't connect the way you expect." Meaning, dear Inspector, that the killer is not hiding among strangers. They're hiding behind the story, behind what we think the story is. Walsh blinked. "You believe Amelia's not the one. I believe Amelia is guilty of many things. Pride, fear, perhaps even jealousy, but not murder." "Then who?" Miss Marple looked toward the lane, where Margaret was walking, arms wrapped around her middle. "That," she said softly, "is the question we must stop asking about the past and begin asking about the present." Meanwhile, the village itself continued to fray. Mrs. Prothero was overheard telling Mrs. Peveril that she'd seen Margaret burning something in the garden late one night. "I thought it was just kitchen scraps," she said. "But then I smelled ink, like old paper." "Perhaps she writes poetry," offered Mrs. Peveril. "Perhaps she writes confessions." And in the market, Mr. Longhurst muttered to his son that he'd heard Amelia had once accused Maureen of seducing William just to spite her. "And if you believe that," he added darkly, "you'll see why she's been walking with a shadow ever since." Miss Marple spent her afternoon at the church, ostensibly dusting the altar cloths. But what she was really doing was remembering a peculiar moment from the first Tuesday meeting, when Amelia Winthrop had dropped a teaspoon and looked as if someone had slapped her. It hadn't been the news of William's absence, not exactly. It had been the presence of someone else in the room. Alice, Margaret, no, not quite. Miss Marple closed her eyes. It had been Margaret, yes, but not because she was there, because she had arrived early, before anyone else, flustered, quiet, red-eyed. And no one had questioned it. That evening, Miss Marple approached Margaret as the girl lit candles in the side chapel. "You miss your father," she said gently. Margaret blinked, startled. Yes, every day. And you came here to find peace? Margaret hesitated, then nodded. I came here because Amelia offered me something I hadn't had in years. Miss Marple smiled kindly. A place to disappear. Margaret stiffened. What do you mean? I mean, Miss Marple said gently, that sometimes, when we are trying to escape our past, we walk straight into the arms of someone else's. Margaret's voice trembled. Why are you saying this? Because William Hartley wasn't trying to expose Amelia. Miss Marple said softly, he was trying to protect you. Margaret's face drained of color. He found something. Miss Marple continued. Something your father left behind. A diary, a letter, something that told him you had seen more than anyone knew the night Marine died. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. He said it would destroy her, she whispered. But I didn't know what to do. When he said he was going to tell the police, I followed him. I just wanted to talk. Miss Marple laid a hand on her arm. But it went wrong. Margaret nodded, broken. He turned to go. I grabbed his coat. He tripped, hit the stones. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to. Miss Marple held her as she wept. Another secret, unnerved. Another truth. Long buried, breaking the surface at last. St. Leonard's in the Fen had always considered itself an honest village. Its people swept their porches, remembered birthdays, and helped each other carry baskets after market day. But honesty, like sunlight, rarely reached beneath the hedges, and by the time a week had passed since William Hartley's death, the shade beneath the hedgerows had grown thick with secrets. Everywhere Miss Marple turned, she saw them. Not new secrets, mind you, but old ones. Secrets polished from decades of being tucked away. Secrets that had been fed in silence until they grew into things far more dangerous than lies. The first to break was Reverend Edgecombe. He found Miss Marple in the churchyard one morning, tending to a drooping clump of marigolds with surprising gentleness for someone her age. He hesitated, hat in hand, then cleared his throat. I ought to speak to someone, Miss Marple. She looked up. You've come to the right patch of soil. He sat on the stone bench near the gate. It was 20 years ago. He began, no closer to 23. William came to me, just after Marine died. He was not himself, haggard. He told me he'd found a letter, a note in Maureen's coat pocket. It had been half washed away by the rain, but he read what he could. Miss Marple's knitting hands paused. A suicide note. Edgecombe shook his head. No, a warning. He exhaled slowly. It said, if I don't come back, it was never an accident. Miss Marple blinked once, then turned back to her flowers. Why didn't you tell the police? William made me swear not to. He said it would destroy people, that he needed time to think. And you believed him? I believed he believed it, the Reverend said quietly, and I believed in the power of remorse. Meanwhile, the schoolhouse cracked as well. Miss Marple had tea with Alice Blanchard again. A quiet affair under the guise of discussing a news story for the children's reading corner. I've been thinking about William, Alice said, stirring her tea. Slowly, he said something to me, something that made no sense at the time. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. He said, "You never see the roots until the tree falls." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And what do you think he meant?" Alice stared into her cup. That something was buried long ago, and that he'd finally found out what. There was a pause, then Alice added, "He asked me to hold onto something." Miss Marple didn't move. Alice reached into her bag and removed a small paper-wrapped bundle. Inside was an old photograph. Two young women, smiling, arms linked, standing in front of a wild, overgrown hedge. In the background, just visible, the edge of the Finchmere crossing gate. On the back was written, "What we chose not to see." That afternoon, Inspector Walsh paced the small path outside the vicarage, notebook in hand, frown deepening. "I've got pieces, Miss Marple," he grumbled, "but none of them connect." "Oh, but they do," Miss Marple said gently, pouring him tea. "They simply don't connect the way you expect. Meaning, dear Inspector, that the killer is not hiding among strangers. They're hiding behind the story. Behind what we think the story is." Walsh blinked. "You believe Amelia's not the one. I believe Amelia is guilty of many things. Pride, fear, perhaps even jealousy, but not murder." "Then who?" Miss Marple looked toward the lane, where Margaret was walking, arms wrapped around her middle. "That," she said softly, "is the question we must stop asking about the past and begin asking about the present." Meanwhile, the village itself continued to fray. Mrs. Prothero was overheard telling Mrs. Peveril that she'd seen Margaret burning something in the garden late one night. "I thought it was just kitchen scraps," she said. "But then I smelled ink, like old paper." "Perhaps she writes poetry," offered Mrs. Peveril. "Perhaps she writes confessions." And in the market, Mr. Longhurst muttered to his son that he'd heard Amelia had once accused Maureen of seducing William just to spite her. "And if you believe that," he added darkly, "you'll see why she's been walking with a shadow ever since." Miss Marple spent her afternoon at the church, ostensibly dusting the altar cloths. But what she was really doing was remembering a peculiar moment from the first Tuesday meeting, when Amelia Winthrop had dropped a teaspoon and looked as if someone had slapped her. It hadn't been the news of William's absence. Not exactly. It had been the presence of someone else. In the room. Alice? Margaret? No. Not quite. Miss Marple closed her eyes. It had been Margaret. Yes. But not because she was there. Because she had arrived early, before anyone else. Flustered. Quiet. Red-eyed. And no one had questioned it. That evening, Miss Marple approached Margaret as the girl lit candles in the side chapel. "You miss your father," she said gently. Margaret blinked, startled. "Yes, every day." "And you came here to find peace?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "I came here because Amelia offered me something I hadn't had in years." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "A place to disappear." Margaret stiffened. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Miss Marple said gently, "that sometimes, when we are trying to escape our past, we walk straight into the arms of someone else's." Margaret's voice trembled. "Why are you saying this?" "Because William Hartley wasn't trying to expose Amelia. Miss Marple said softly, "He was trying to protect you." Margaret's face drained of colour. "He found something," Miss Marple continued. "Something your father left behind. A diary, a letter, something that told him you had seen more than anyone knew the night Marine died." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "He said it would destroy her," she whispered. "But I didn't know what to do. When he said he was going to tell the police, I followed him. I just wanted to talk." Miss Marple laid a hand on her arm. "But it went wrong." Margaret nodded, broken. He turned to go. I grabbed his coat. He tripped, hit the stones. I didn't mean to. Miss Marple held her as she wept. Another secret, unnerved. Another truth, long buried, breaking the surface at last. The next morning, the village awoke to news that spread like warm jam over toast. Amelia Winthrop had been taken in for questioning. It wasn't an arrest. Not yet, but the sight of Inspector Walsh escorting her into the parish hall with Sergeant Willis close behind was enough to confirm what most of St. Leonard's had already decided. The only question left, as they saw it, was how she had done it. "She probably lured him there," said Mrs. Constance Biddle, never one to let ambiguity interfere with storytelling. "Said she wanted to make peace, and when he refused, she struck him." "With what?" asked Reverend Edgecombe disapprovingly. "She's a woman. She wouldn't need much. A rock, a cane, perhaps even pushed him off balance." "Poor soul," added Mrs. Prothero. All these years of silence, and then bang. "Poetic, in a way," someone else muttered. "Always thought she had a darkness in her." No one noticed Margaret slip out of the bakery without a word. Inside the parish hall, Amelia sat stiffly, her coat folded neatly across her lap. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were clear. Inspector Walsh paced slowly. "Miss Winthrop," he began, "you told us you hadn't seen Mr. Hartley since the weekend. But we now have a statement from a villager who saw you near the railway path on the afternoon of his death." Amelia didn't blink. "I was walking. I often walk that way." "Did you see Mr. Hartley?" "I did not." "But you had argued with him, hadn't you?" Her voice wavered. "Yes, a week earlier. He said he was going to tell people what happened to Maureen." Walsh leaned forward. "And you didn't want him to." Amelia's face crumpled for the briefest second. "I wanted him to let it rest. To let her rest. And if he wouldn't," she looked up, eyes fierce, "then I would have lived with it. As I have lived with everything." Walsh studied her a long moment. "You're very calm." "I am exhausted, Inspector." Outside, Miss Marple stood with Eliza Huntley under the lilac bush, watching the scene unfold through the open window. "She didn't do it," Eliza murmured. "No," said Miss Marple, "but she's willing to carry the suspicion." "Why would she do that?" "Because she thinks Margaret did." Eliza's brow furrowed. "But how could she know?" "Because guilt recognizes guilt, even when no one says a word. Amelia has always believed herself to be the reason Maureen died. She's lived under that shadow. She knows what it looks like in someone else. Do you think she's protecting her?" Miss Marple paused, then nodded. "Yes, but not out of affection, out of penance. Meanwhile, Margaret was in the garden behind the vicarage, standing very still among the gooseberry bushes. The truth was coiling around her now, suffocating in its silence. She hadn't meant to hurt William. Truly, she hadn't. She'd only meant to stop him, to delay him. But when he fell, when he didn't get up, she had panicked. She had run. And later, when Amelia had asked, gently, if she'd gone walking that day, if she'd seen anything, Margaret had nodded without words. Amelia had known, and Amelia had said nothing. Back at the parish hall, Walsh ended the interview with a frustrated sigh. "You're not giving me what I need, Miss Winthrop. I'm giving you the truth," she said. He turned away, muttering, "Then perhaps I'm chasing the wrong truth." Outside, Miss Marple stepped in before he could leave. "A word, Inspector?" He looked at her with weary eyes. At this point, Miss Marple, "I'll take words from anyone." She offered a faint smile. "You're chasing the red herring. I'm afraid, Amelia, she is guilty of guilt, not murder." Walsh raised a brow. "And who is guilty, in your view?" Miss Marple looked down the path where Margaret was now kneeling beside the lilies, hands buried in the soil like a child hiding stolen sweets. "The one who never meant to kill," she said softly, "but did, and then didn't know how to undo it." That evening, a strange stillness settled over St. Leonard's. The sun dipped behind the orchard. The breeze grew colder, and the church bell rang out a single note as if mourning something it couldn't name. Amelia sat in her drawing room, eyes distant, hands folded like a prayer. She did not speak. She did not cry. Margaret sat in her bedroom, window open, hair unbrushed, staring at the little wooden box in her lap, the one that held the letter William had left her father long ago. A letter of regret, a letter that warned of truth and forgiveness, and how both could be unbearable. Alice Blanchard wrote in her diary, "I think something terrible is coming. I don't know what, but I feel it in my bones. The whole village is holding its breath." And Miss Marple, in the guest room beneath the ticking clock, folded her knitting and watched the dark blue across the sky. She had seen this pattern before. The false suspect, the tightening noose, the real killer teetering on the edge of confession. It would only take one slip, one word, one gesture to break it all open. And tomorrow, she would set that moment in motion. It was the scream that shattered the village calm. High, thin, and unmistakably real. The kind of sound that sliced through rose-scented mornings and made even birds pause mid-flight. It came from the vicarage garden. By the time Inspector Walsh and Sergeant Willis reached the scene, Margaret was sitting in the grass, rocking slightly, her dress streaked with soil, her face blank as wet ash. I didn't know it was there," she whispered. "I was planting. I didn't know." Miss Marple was already there, standing just outside the flower bed, watching at Margaret's feet. Barely disturbed by the garden fork was a leather-bound book, cracked spine, water-warped pages, and inside a folded note. The vicarage study was silent, but for the ticking of the grandfather clock. When Inspector Walsh opened the note with gloved hands, Miss Marple, seated across from him, already knew what it would say. He read aloud in a slow, measured voice. I should have spoken sooner. The weight of silence is heavier than guilt. If anything happens to me, it is because the truth is close and someone is afraid. Please forgive me for not naming names. I hoped it would never come to this. WHA dated page in the diary, belonging to Margaret's late father, told the rest. Years ago, he had been out walking late and had witnessed an argument at Finchmere crossing. Two young women, voices sharp, the word liar shouted. A sudden push, then silence. He'd arrived too late to save the girl who had fallen, Maureen, and too terrified to confront the girl who had fled. But he'd seen her face. He had written it all down. He had never shown anyone, not even William. Hardly his old friend until months before his death. That's the twist, isn't it? Walsh muttered, pacing. Margaret knew. She found the diary. She showed William. He realized Maureen hadn't just slipped, and he told Margaret he was going. To the police, Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, but he didn't get the chance. Because Margaret panicked, not for herself, but for the shadow it would cast on her father. His silence, his failure to act. She wasn't trying to stop William forever, just delay him. Walsh stopped pacing. But why bury the diary? She didn't. Not at first. She kept it in her room. But when William died, when suspicion began to swirl around Amelia, she realized what would happen if it were found. So she buried it. In the vicarage garden, Walsh said, in plain reach of a shovel. Miss Marple gave him a look. Sometimes the places closest to us feel safest, until the earth shifts. That evening, Margaret sat in the drawing room, pale and hollow, her hands wrapped in a shawl that did nothing for the cold she carried. Amelia stood at the window, arms folded. She had not spoken since the note was read aloud. I thought I was protecting you, she finally said. I know, Margaret whispered. But I wasn't. I was protecting a version of you that didn't exist. One that had no shadows. One that had no choices. Margaret blinked. I didn't mean to kill him. I know that too. Amelia turned. Her eyes were red, but clear. We must tell the truth now. Margaret's voice shook. Even if it breaks us, Amelia sat beside her and took her hand, especially then. Inspector Walsh delivered his report with cool precision. William Hartley's death, he concluded, had been the result of a fall, unintentional, but not unprovoked. No charges were filed, but a statement of confession from Margaret was entered into the official record. The diary and the note were sealed in the village archives. Maureen's grave was cleaned, her name ray-etched by a silent stonemason paid for quietly by someone who never said. The village responded with the kind of politeness reserved for scandals too sad to discuss. Mrs. Biddle stopped gossiping, at least out loud. The vicar's sermons grew longer, softer, more unsure. Alice Blanchard rewrote the school recital to include a reading from Christina Rossetti. After all, when I am dead, my dearest, sing no sad songs for me. And as for Miss Marple, she spent a quiet afternoon at Finchmere Crossing, brushing moss from the gate, picking up a single fallen forget-me-not, and placing it gently on the path where a man had once paused to choose truth over silence. It was late that night when Miss Marple finally allowed herself to rest her needles and fold the half-wear-upon shawl into her lap. Outside, the wind sighed through the hedges and rustled the ivy like soft fingers turning the pages of a well-worn diary. The village had grown quiet again, but it was not the peace of innocence. It was the stillness after a truth has finally taken shape. The case, according to official opinion, was closed. There had been no killer in the traditional sense. No malice, no poison, no gunshot in the dark. Just a chain of consequences, unspoken things, and a fall. But Miss Marple knew better. Not in the way of evidence. In the way of people. She sat in the guest room of the vicarage, hands folded, eyes drifting toward the half-shadowed corner, where her valise sat packed, but forgotten. Tomorrow she would return to St. Mary Mead. But tonight she allowed her mind to wander where the law dared not tread. It began not with Margaret's confession, but with what followed it. The village had sighed with relief. Yes, but some had sighed too quickly, too easily. Alice Blanchard, for one, had changed. Overnight, from anxious and watchful to serene, settled her diary entries. According to the Reverend, who had a passing glance at her borrowed notebook, had taken a tone of completion, as though something had ended that was not hers to end. And then there was Amelia Winthrop, once sharp and guarded, now soft and oddly free. She no longer flinched when someone mentioned Maureen's name. She no longer stiffened at the sight of Margaret. It wasn't healing. It was relief. But that didn't make sense, did it? Not if the truth they had believed was the whole truth. Miss Marple rose from her chair and crossed to the writing desk, where she kept a private notebook for thoughts she would never read aloud. She opened it, slowly. At the top of the page, in her tidy hand, she wrote, "What if Margaret didn't push him?" It was a question she had resisted for days, because Margaret had believed she did. But belief and memory, Miss Marple knew too well, were not always one and the same, especially when grief entered the room. She replayed the scene in her mind. William, hardly burdened with guilt, holding the diary that revealed the truth about Maureen. He intends to speak, to reveal, to clean the wound. He walks to the crossing, as he always does. Margaret follows. She tries to dissuade him. There is a struggle, and then William falls, bruised behind the ear, shoe thrown off the path, diary missing. The simplest answer, the inspector had said, was that Margaret had caused it. But Miss Marple knew. The simplest answer is only ever simple when you stop asking questions. What if someone else had been watching? What if Margaret had left, flustered, crying, unaware that someone else had been in the trees near the fence? Someone who had followed both of them. Someone who had something to lose, not from Maureen's truth, but from William's intention to reveal it. She thought of Alice Blanchard again. How she had taken in the confession like a sponge takes in tea, without a drop spilled. How her fear had melted into calm. How she had said, "He asked me to hold onto something," and then offered a photograph. One, Miss Marple now recalled that William had never mentioned, one that could just as easily have been found, not given. She stood suddenly, the weight of realization falling into place like a clasp clicking shut. Alice had been the last to speak to William, the last to see him. But what if she had been more? What if she had followed, too? Not to listen, not to protect the past, but to protect something much more immediate, a reputation, a safety, a story. What if Alice, clever, quiet, observant Alice, had seen William holding the diary and panicked, not because of what was in it, but because it would cast suspicion away from Amelia and toward her? Miss Marple sat back down and stared at the fire. She would never say it aloud. There was no evidence, no confession, no bruise on Alice's conscience that she could point to in court. But she knew. She saw it in the timing dot in the flower that had been placed, gently, deliberately, on William's chest, before he was found. A forget-me-not, Alice's signature, planted in the church garden, placed near the crossing, a final message from someone who wanted to be remembered, but not blamed. A silent "I was here." The next morning, Miss Marple said her goodbyes. Alice smiled and offered her a small bouquet, mostly wildflowers. Miss Marple accepted it graciously and tucked one pressed blue flower between the pages of her notebook before the train left the station. She would tell no one. There was no need. The truth had already changed the village. That was punishment enough. Miss Marple had never considered herself a trap setter, not in the sense that policemen used the word, with bait and hiding places, and the moment of springing. But over the years, she had learned that people, especially the guilty ones, always set their own traps. All they needed was someone to give them the right space, the right silence, and a very small nudge. That's how people revealed themselves, not in the courtroom, in the parlor. And so she planned a tea. The invitations were simple, a small gathering to thank her hosts before returning to St. Mary Mead. Just for guests: Amelia Winthrop, Alice Blanchard, Margaret, and Inspector Walsh. Tea to be served in the garden at 3:30. It was a polite, ordinary thing. The sort of village ritual no one questioned, especially not when Miss Marple was behind the teacups. Eliza Huntley raised an eyebrow when she saw the guest list. "You're bringing all the ghosts into one garden, Jane." "Exactly," Miss Marple said, spooning out raspberry jam. At 3:30 on the dot. The garden was set, wicker chairs in a crescent, the table dressed in starched linen, cucumber sandwiches arranged in perfect rows, a plate of sponge cake stood like a quiet offering. Alice arrived first, calm and cordial. Then Amelia, arms folded tightly across her shawl. Margaret came alone, eyes down. Walsh brought up the rear, his presence more curious than official. Miss Marple poured tea as if this were a conversation about biscuits. Only when everyone was seated did she speak. "I've been thinking," she said gently, "about how stories end." The cups paused. Most people assume a story ends when the bad person is found out. But that's only true in fairy tales. In villages, in real life, stories end when people stop telling them. or when the wrong ending is accepted simply because it's tidy. Alice shifted slightly in her chair. Margaret looked up, a frown forming. Amelia sat rigid. UNMOVING. Inspector Walsh watched, saying nothing. I remember. Miss Marple continued. An old tale my governess told me when I was a girl, about a woman who lived in a forest and tended to lost children. They all loved her, until one day, one of them went missing. Everyone believed the woman had eaten her, and they burned down her house. But the truth was, the child had simply wandered too far, fallen into a ravine. She paused to sip her tea, but the story had taken root. And once a story is planted, it grows. Whether it's true or not, still, no one spoke. So she turned to Margaret. Do you still believe you killed William? Margaret's throat moved. I don't know. Miss Marple nodded softly, then turned to Amelia. Do you believe she did? Amelia's voice cracked. I did. And now, a long pause. I'm not sure. Miss Marple finally turned to Alice. Do you believe she did? Alice blinked. Miss Marple. I don't, because if I remember, Miss Marple said, her tone still soft, still terribly kind. You were the last person he spoke to. You admitted as much. You said he was troubled. You said he needed comfort. Alice's hands tensed in her lap. You said he gave you something to keep. Miss Marple went on. But then you handed over a photograph that he never mentioned. A photograph you claimed he wanted preserved. But it's odd, because William was always precise about his belongings. He labeled everything. He never handed out photographs casually. He trusted me, Alice said. Her voice was growing defensive. Did he? Miss Marple said gently. Or did you take it? Afterward, the silence deepened. Even the birds seemed to hush. And then Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and pulled out a single dried flower, a pressed forget-me-not, found near his body, she said, placing it in the center of the table. You said you gave him one weeks earlier, but this one was fresh. It had no signs of age, no damage, no travel wear. She looked directly at Alice now. Her voice remained soft, as though reciting a bedtime story. You left it there, didn't you? As a mark, as a signature. Alice's face paled. No, you followed him that day, after Margaret had gone. You saw the diary. You realized what it meant, not just for Maureen, but for you. Because Maureen knew about something else, didn't she? I didn't kill him, Alice whispered. But you confronted him. No, you argued. I asked him to wait. You grabbed his sleeve. He lost his footing, hit his head. No, you didn't mean to, but you didn't help him either. You watched. You froze. Then you placed that flower. Alice stood suddenly, knocking over her teacup. He was going to ruin everything. Walsh rose slowly. And so you let Margaret take the blame, Miss Marple said. Because it was easy. Because she believed she had done it. Because Amelia would protect her. Alice was trembling. I didn't push him. I didn't mean for it to happen. He turned too fast. I reached for him. He slipped. And you said nothing. Miss Marple finished. The trap had closed. Alice looked at the others. at Amelia, who stared with silent horror at Margaret, whose mouth was open in disbelief, and then at Miss Marple, who looked not triumphant, but sad. Very, very sad. Inspector Walsh led Alice away, not in handcuffs, not yet, but in understanding that silence was no longer a defense. And Miss Marple, alone now with her cooling tea, sighed once and leaned back in her chair. No monsters, just frightened people, wounded people, people who believed they were doing what they must. But stories, she thought again, don't end when the guilty are caught. They end when the truth is no longer too heavy to speak aloud. The garden was nearly empty now. Only crumbs and petals remained, the polite aftermath of a polite storm. Miss Marple stayed behind to gather the plates, but her mind was elsewhere. She was watching it happen again in her head. The moment when truth stepped out, not with a confession, but with a slip. Alice's outburst hadn't been dramatic. It hadn't been cruel, but it had been unguarded. He turned to fast. Such an ordinary sentence, but one no one had mentioned before. Not even Margaret. Because no one, not even the police, had spoken publicly about how William fell. Not the angle, not the turn, not the footing. Only someone present at the moment of the fall could have said it, and Alice had. She had tried to retreat after the words were out, tried to rewrite them in the moment, to call them hypothetical, imagined, concerned. But the damage was done. The truth, like a cut thread, had unraveled. Inspector Walsh said nothing as they walked back to the parish hall. He didn't need to. He had seen it, too. A small thing. He said finally, so small I nearly missed it. Miss Marple nodded. The smallest things often are. That's why they slip past the clever ones. She won't be charged, not formally, he added. No proof, no weapon, no bruises that point to her. Only her words, and only in front of a few. She doesn't need a courtroom. Miss Marple said, she's already sentenced herself. Walsh looked over at her. You mean guilt? I mean she'll live in a village where everyone knows the truth, and no one will say it aloud. That is a prison far older than Pentonville. Alice returned to the schoolhouse the next day. Her classes were smaller, her voice quieter. She stopped tending the flowers outside the church. The forget-me-nots withered. Amelia Winthrop left town a week later. No explanation, just a letter left on the vicar's desk. Short, elegant, unsigned. I believe some roots cannot be dug up without damaging the garden, but I no longer wish to be the gardener who prunes around the rot. I am tired. Let the next season bloom without me. She moved to Brighton, someone said, or Bath, or back to her sister in Devon. The truth didn't matter, only the absence. Margaret stayed. She began volunteering at the church, organizing hymnals, sorting donations, helping children practice their reading. She no longer flinched when someone said Maureen's name. She spoke little of William, but once, just once, Miss Marple overheard her say to the Reverend, he didn't die in vain. He cleared the path. As for Miss Marple, she returned to St. Mary Mead with little fanfare and even less baggage. She wrote no letters about the case. She told no stories in the tea room. She did not mention Finchmere crossing again, not even to Raymond, who always begged for tales from her travels. But she kept one thing in a drawer beside her bed. Between a lace handkerchief and a very old train schedule lay a single pressed flower, a forget-me-not, and whenever she came across it, while reaching for a pair of gloves or putting away a brooch, she paused not in sadness, not in anger, but in memory because in the end, that was what stories asked for not forgiveness, not even justice, just to be remembered. The case was never reopened. Inspector Walsh wrote a report so measured, so thoroughly non-committal, that it might have been mistaken for an account of a missing bicycle, rather than the slow, sorrowful unspooling of a village's longest buried guilt. The official cause of death remained unchanged: accidental fall, contributing factor, underlying heart condition. But there were murmurs, as there always are in places where the soil remembers better than the people. They said something had shifted that summer in St. Leonard's. In the fen, the air had changed. The silence had weight again, but it was a different silence now, no longer heavy with secrets, but with the knowledge that not all truths come with answers, and not all answers come clean. It was in that moment, days after the tea, weeks after the fall, that Miss Marple was asked, quite directly, by Reverend Edgecombe. He met her on her walk toward the station, where she was waiting for the midday train back to St. Mary Mead. The platform smelled of dust and wild thyme, and pigeons hopped near the iron benches like old men with nowhere to be. "I was wondering," he said, doffing his hat with clergyman awkwardness, "if you'd tell me what really happened." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "What do you think happened, Reverend?" The poor man fidgeted. "Well," the girl confessed. "Then didn't. Then the school teacher. Well," he trailed off. "I don't know, Miss Marple. It all feels like a dream one wakes from and can't quite retell." She looked at him kindly, gently. "Then let me try." And so she told him. She told him about the diary Margaret's father had left behind, the witness account that had sat unread for years. She told him how William had found it, and how it awakened in him not revenge, but a weary, urgent need for truth. She told him how he confided in Alice, the school teacher whose sense of order ran as deep as William's own, whose garden beds were lined like ledger books. She told him how Alice, confronted with the risk of that truth spilling out, followed him to the crossing, not to kill, not to threaten, but to stop. How she reached for him startled him, and he fell. A moment, a gasp, a stillness, and then a flower, a signature, placed there like a benediction or a curse. She'd wanted someone to understand. She just hadn't wanted it to be her. Reverend Edgecombe listened in silence. When she finished, he looked down at his polished shoes, as if seeking moral clarity in the scuffs. "Why didn't you tell the inspector all this?" Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "Because it isn't his to carry. But justice, she said, is not always a courtroom, and confession is not always the truth. Sometimes, Reverend, people need to live with what they've done more than they need to be punished for it." He frowned. "You still believe in sin, though?" "Oh yes," she said brightly. "But I also believe in consequences. And Alice, Blanchard will feel hers for the rest of her days. Every time she teaches a child how to spell the word for. The train arrived with a slow whistle, the doors hissing open like an exhalation. Miss Marple climbed aboard with no fuss, placed her basket on the rack, and took her seat beside the window dot as the platform slipped away behind her. The hedgerows, the low walls, the spire of the church rising like a needle. She didn't wave. She simply folded her hands in her lap and watched Dot, not with satisfaction, but with quiet understanding. Dot in her mind. The scene played again. Not the fall, not the flower, but the tea. The way Alice had spoken too quickly, the slip. He turned to fast, and the second one, smaller, almost lost in the noise. I only meant to stop him. I didn't think he'd fall like that, miss. Marple had filed it away, quietly, like a misplaced button in her sewing drawer. All people reveal themselves eventually, even the ones who knit careful lives out of silence. By the time she arrived home in St. Mary Mead, the roses were in bloom, and the cats had returned to their favorite places. The village clock still ticked a second to fast, and Raymond had sent her a postcard with a drawing of an absurd hotel in Venice. Life, as it tends to do, went on. But that night, as she unpacked her belongings, she paused to slip one thing into a small wooden box in her bedside drawer. The forget-me-not dot pressed between pages, unnamed, undated, but remembered. The murder that hadn't been called a murder left behind no prison sentence, no trial, and no public reckoning. But it left something else, something more lasting. An ache beneath the hedgerows. A stiffness in the way people now nodded at one another across market stalls. A quietness that went deeper than politeness. The village of St. Leonard's in the Fen had not lost its calm. It had lost its innocence, and no one felt it more than the three women at the center of it all. Margaret, who had confessed too soon and blamed herself too much, now lived in a state of daily penance. Though no one asked it of her. She kept to the edges of conversations. She dressed more simply, spoke more gently, smiled more rarely. But it wasn't shame anymore. It was something quieter. Acceptance, perhaps. Once, she had stood in the garden with Amelia and said, "I feel like I'm trying to remember a version of myself I only imagined I could be." Amelia had replied, "Then start there." And she had. She joined the sewing circle. She wrote to her cousins. She baked loaves for the widows and stitched hymnal covers in the evenings. Her fingers still trembled when the topic of William came up, but she no longer left the room. Some days, she even hummed. Amelia Winthrop became, in her own way, a ghost. She didn't move far, just far enough. A cottage near the coast, a place with salt in the air and no memories in the brick. She wrote letters, but never sent them. She grew fuchsias and read detective novels and did not speak of Maureen again, not even in the quiet of her own thoughts. But one Sunday, the vicar received a parcel. Inside was a single page torn from a diary, wrapped in tissue. It read, "We are not defined by what we did, but by what we were too afraid to do. I see that now. I should have spoken. No name, but everyone knew. He burned it in the church fireplace after reading it twice. Not to destroy it, but to release it. Alice Blanchard remained. She had no choice, really. There was no formal charge, no trial, but there was a reckoning. Not legal, but local. Her classroom stayed full. But the air inside had changed. Children, sensitive to shifts adults ignored, grew quieter in her presence. Parents became more formal. The way they said Miss Blanchard carried a shade of extra distance. And Alice, who had once taken great care in her appearance, now seemed to move through the village as if wrapped in gauze. Invisible, almost untouchable. The flower beds outside the school wilted in the heat of that summer. She never replanted them. And the forget-me-nots never bloomed again. Reverend Edgecombe mentioned once, to no one in particular, that St. Leonard's had absorbed its sin, that the village had taken the shock and digested it like old bread, dry, hard, necessary. But Miss Marple, writing quietly in her garden in St. Mary Mead, disagreed. She wrote in her notebook, St. Leonard's did not absorb its sin. It simply learned to live beside it. The crossing remains. So does the truth. As for Miss Marple herself, she never sought recognition. She never spoke of the case again, not even when asked. But every now and then, when passing through a village or tending her garden, she would glance toward the earth and think, what truths lie sleeping here, and which ones still walk beside us, unspoken, wearing other names? Because every village, she knew, had its Finchmere crossing, its quiet place of reckoning, its unburied moment. And sometimes that moment wore a smile. Summer passed slowly in St. Leonard's, in the fen, as it always did, in rustling barley fields, in rose hips ripening on the hedgerows, in the turning of linen tablecloths from white to cream in the sunshine. But though the rhythms returned, they no longer hummed the same tune. Life had resumed, yes, but something beneath it had shifted, something subtle. You would not notice it in the clink of a teacup or the creak of a gate, but it was there, just behind the curtain of ordinary things. The Women's Fellowship Circle met again in early September. There was sponge cake. There were discussions about which preserves had taken properly and which had curdled. There was even laughter, but there was also a space at the end of the table where Amelia used to sit. It remained unclaimed. No one mentioned it, but no one sat there either. Reverend Edgecombe gave his Sunday sermon on restoration. He spoke of forgiveness in tones more weary than grand, of seeds planted in thin soil, of rebuilding houses that creaked in every beam. He did not mention William Hartley by name. He did not need to. Everyone understood. Margaret walked through the market now with her sleeves rolled and a basket of apples on her arm. People greeted her with warmth, not pity, and when the younger children at the schoolhouse waved at her, she waved back without hesitation. Her face still bore traces of what had passed, the kind of softness that comes not from fragility, but from breaking and being put back together. More than once, she was seen by the railway path, placing wildflowers near the edge of the fence. Not forget-me-nots. That would have been too pointed. She chose buttercups instead. Bright, small, unapologetic. Alice Blanchard remained in her post, But her energy was different now, reserved, distant. She no longer stayed late to clean the chalkboards, and she stopped offering poetry for the end-of-term recitals. The stories she told in class were shorter, safer. She smiled when spoken to. She nodded when thanked. But she was no longer the teacher whose presence warmed the room. And though her house remained tidy, the flower beds had been left to their own quiet overgrowth. One afternoon in October, a letter arrived for Miss Marple in St. Mary Mead. It had no return address, only a careful hand and a Dorset postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I have thought about what you didn't say more than what you did. I think that's what clever people do. Let silence carry the weight. I'm trying to do something with what's left. If you ever pass this way again, I hope you'll find things in bloom. It was unsigned, but there was a small pressed flower tucked into the fold, not a forget-me-not. A daisy. Miss Marple read the note in her garden, then folded it and slipped it into a small drawer beside her chair. She watched the bees drift over her lavender. She listened to the ticking of the kitchen clock. She did not smile, but she did close her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them, the world seemed just a shade more forgiving, because that is how life returns. Not loudly, not with declarations, but quietly, through routine. Through tea poured without trembling, through greetings without shame, through the planting of flowers not to remember, but to begin again. It was some months later, late November, when Miss Marple received the second letter. This one was different, not just because of the handwriting, which was unfamiliar, or the envelope, which bore no return address. It was the weight of the letter that caught her attention, as if it carried something heavier than paper. Inside was a single sheet of folded parchment and a flat, rusted object wrapped in wax paper. The letter read, "She didn't mean to, but she let it happen, and then she walked away. I didn't speak because I thought it would destroy her. Maybe it did anyway. I've carried this too long." It was in her coat pocket that night. I found it when I took her home. She never asked about it, never noticed it was gone. I couldn't forget, but I couldn't tell. You'll know what to do with it. There was no name, no signature, just the object, a small brass locket, dull with time. Miss Marple opened it. Inside were two things: a photo of Maureen, young, laughing, her hair tangled by the wind, and a scrap of paper folded into a tight square. She unfolded. It slowly. In faded ink. If she dies, it wasn't an accident. Miss Marple stared at the words for a long time. Then at the photo. Then at the locket. She sat back in her chair, tea cooling beside her, the ticking clock loud in the silence. So Maureen had known. She'd feared it, expected it. Perhaps she'd written that note for William, or for anyone who might find it. Perhaps it was her attempt to leave behind more than silence. The locket had disappeared from every version of the story. No one had mentioned it. No one had admitted to finding it. Until now. And the letter, whoever had written it, was haunted. Possibly Amelia, possibly Margaret, possibly even the Reverend. The phrasing bore none of Alice's careful restraint. Whoever it was, they had kept it all these years. longer than they should have, to long for justice. Not too late for the truth. Miss Marple wrapped the locket again and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her mementos, a playing card from another case, a fragment of china from a poisoned tea set, a single bone button from a jacket never claimed. She did not send it to the police. There was no point, but she wrote something of her own that evening in her private journal, in her smallest, neatest hand. Not all ghosts are dead. Some of them write letters. Some of them still live in houses with curtains drawn too early. But the truth, even a buried one, has a way of asking to be held. And sometimes that's enough. Far away, in a coastal town where fuchsias bloomed through the salt air, a woman awoke one morning and reached instinctively for a locket that had not been there in years, and found her fingers paused in the air. She stared out the window for a long while, and did not speak. And in St. Leonard's, in the fen, Finchmere crossing sat quietly. The grass grew thick again round the fence. Children avoided the path without knowing why, and the wind carried, now and then, a sound like a woman's voice, faint, certain, lingering. You'll know what to do with it. Miss Marple did. She always had.